Maseh, the final parsha of Numbers, it can be one of those Torah portions that you wonder why you have to read all of these complicated to say places. As I said earlier, there are 42 places they stopped, and each one is named. It's one of those Torah portions that you might just kind of glaze over and say, oh my goodness, it's like all the begats, all of the names of the people that come. Now we have place names here. But our tradition never sees anything as extraneous in Torah, especially since much of the text is written in such a compact kind of way. So Rashi, the great medieval commentator, says that the reason that all of these places are enumerated is to remind us, as I said earlier, that God was with us on the journey, and that God was compassionate with us on the journey, and that God had showed us where we needed to go on our journey. But now the Israelites are on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and they're about to enter the land, and they have to create their own society. No longer will they receive a portion of manna to eat every day. No longer will they have those physical reminders of God's presence. God will not be guiding them with a pillar of cloud by day or a pillar of fire by night. How will they experience God's compassion as they create their own society in the land of Israel? Well, the answer is through living by Torah. Each and every morning in our worship service, we say these words, "Elu dvarim she'en lehem shi'ur." These are the things that you must do without measure, meaning you should do them as much as you possibly can, and the reward, too, for doing them is without measure. And there are things like kibud av v'em, honoring our parents, doing acts of loving kindness, gimilut chasadim, nichum avelim, comforting the mourner, and bikur cholim, visiting the sick. Yes, these are the ways in which God's compassion lives in our world today, is through our hands and our hearts, and uplifting and upholding what God has shown for us to do. The soul stitchers at Beth Emet are a prime example of people doing the work of gimilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, and bikur cholim, of visiting the sick, bringing comfort to those who are in need of healing of body and healing of spirit. A healing shawl is that healing hug that lasts a long time after you have left. That there is the warmth not just of the wool, but of the spirit behind that shawl, the person who created it, the loving community that is giving you a hug. Many years ago, on the High Holy Days, I spoke about a tradition that we have within Judaism, that although there are 613 commandments according to Jewish tradition, that for each and every one of us, there's one particular commandment that speaks to the individuality of our soul. And part of the task of our life is to figure out what could that one commandment be that I could do without shiur, that I could do without end, because it really is about who I am and the gifts that I bring to this world. Shortly after I gave that sermon, Nikki Zarevsky, Zichronah Livracha, may her memory always be a blessing, she called me and she said, "Andrea, I'd like to meet with you, and I'd like to talk with you about an idea that I have." And she came into my office with this book, Knitting into the Mystery. And she said, there's something called a shawl knitting ministry that is done in Christian churches, where they knit healing shawls and other things for people in the community who are in need. And as you know, I love to knit. And not only did Nikki love to knit, she was a master knitter. I don't think I've ever met anybody as talented as Nikki. I'm looking at David, and he can shake his head to agree on that. Her knitting was just absolutely spectacular. And she said, "I think that this is the mitzvah you were talking about for me. that this is the mitzvah that I need to do. This is that sacred obligation that speaks to my talents and to my heart, and I want to create a group here at Beth Emet that does that. Of course, we don't call those kinds of groups in our Jewish congregations as ministries. They're really acts of what I would call gemilut chasadim, groups that do acts of loving kindness. We're going to have to find a way, to add on to that. A guide to the shawl knitting ministry and gemilut chasadim for the Jews here. But that's exactly what Nikki wanted to do. And Nikki was an incredibly skillful and loving person, and she put together a group. And I remember they used to meet downstairs in the Perlman room in the youth lounge, and we used to have extra yarn that was down there that people would use, and they would come and they would knit. And I do remember some of the people who belonged to that group trying desperately to teach me to knit. Unfortunately, that is not the mitzvah that works with these hands, but I really admire for those who can really knit beautifully, as you can see our Soul Stitcher group is able to do. And so it's really wonderful that Bluma Stoller revived this group. And during COVID, especially when all of us were trying to find ways in which we could be together as community and offer strength and love and comfort to each other as community, and also have things that we could do within our own home. And Bluma said, I want to do this. I remember the Soul Stitchers, what happened to them. And I said, well, Nikki died a number of years ago, and many of the other people in the group are no longer with us as well. But perhaps it's time that there are other knitters who are out there, people who would like to bring their hearts and their souls and their hands to this kind of work. And so we're really grateful that Bluma Stoller revived this group, and now look at all these amazing healing shawls that they have knitted. So I'm going to invite Bluma to come and speak for a few moments about what motivated her to do this and what she finds meaningful in this Gemilut Chasadim project. And then after that, I'm also going to invite David Zareski, Nikki's widower, to speak about Nikki and about her knitting and about what Soul Stitchers meant to her.
I only came to Beth Emet about 10 years ago, and she was already ill. And, well, I could hear about this amazing, amazing woman. When I joined, I heard about her, and people described her as having a light. And she knit wherever she went and gathered friends to knit with her, knit or crochet. They weren't only knitting, and they were knitting for people who were cold during services and needed something to warm them. People who needed an extra layer against the winter wind, or who were sick and in a hospital, which is usually very cold, or at home. So this became Nikki's legend for us. Indeed, when I came here and started looking for wool, I found them all over the synagogue. I found them in different rooms. I found them in the Weiner room. There were piles and piles of wool that she had left for us. And I thought, you have to do something with this. At the start of the pandemic, I, with the encouragement of Rabbi London and Becky Kaplan and Marty Nidler, and of course David, started to revive her wonderful project. Thus, Soul Stitchers returned to Beth Emet in 2021, and wonderful, wonderful women joined the group. We now have about 10 women, and guys, you're more than welcome to join us. We're wondering where you are. We meet on the first Tuesday of the month at 7:30, and we meet on Zoom. Some of those people knew Nikki. Most didn't. Some are experienced Beth Emet members. Others recently joined, and some are working in different medium, not just knitting and purling. Many of the members made 2 or 3 shawls, not just one, since we started, and we've become friends. Beth Emmet friends who may have never known each other had we not taken on this wonderful project. We've honored Nikki's notion that each shawl be given anonymously, the creation of the shawl being the only recognition needed. Thus, you'll see a label in each of the shawls that we have up here, reading "Handmade by Beth Emmet Sew Stitchers." Our shawls are a gift to those who need them, and no individual is recognized as such. Rabbi London will recognize those of us who are sew stitchers in a little bit, so I won't do it now. But I want you to know we'll continue knitting shawls, healing shawls, and are discussing several other sew stitcher knitting and purling projects. We ask us to join us. We ask you to join us. You need not be an expert knitter. I certainly am not. And we'll help you as best we can. If you know the knit and purl stitches or crochet stitches, we're waiting for you. Everyone, no matter who you are welcome to bring wool and needles and good cheer. You want to know about sew stitchers? Look and be connected. That's what it's for. You'll see a link when we're meeting, and we would love to hear from you, or you can even call me and I'll fill you in. We hope that Nikki would be proud. I received an email from Becky Kaplan, and she asked me to read it. It really describes Nikki, Zichrona Levracha. And Becky wrote, "I'm very sorry to miss tomorrow night." She wrote this last night. "Currently have a mild case of COVID, but we'll be watching on a live stream. Love how we are honoring Nikki's memory in such a wonderful way. I'll never forget when she gave Hannah, our daughter, knitting needles when she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Hannah still knits to this day, and I am the loving recipient of great sweaters she has made during lockdown. I will forever be indebted to what Nikki did and for Hannah, and it's such a sad moment for us all." Becky. David?
Yes, please, David.
We have to thank David, who really encouraged me and the rest of us to take this on and to keep the legend alive.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Bluma. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Anyone who knew my wife, Nikki, even casually, will remember that she was a compulsive knitter. Or perhaps I should say that was her one mitzvah without end. Whether she was attending a meeting, listening to a lecture, hearing an audiobook, watching television, going to the movies, she had her wrists moving with a pair of knitting needles as she moved along one or more balls of yarn into beautiful finished products. In her last months, when she had to eat very slowly in order to be able to swallow it all, she would pace herself between bites by knitting a row of whatever project it was that she was working on. One time we were attending a Live from the Met performance, and a real opera maven sitting behind us tapped Nikki on the shoulder and said, "Would you please stop knitting? The noise of the knitting needles is distracting me from the opera." And I asked Nikki afterwards why was she so annoyed by this request, and she said, "Because those weren't ordinary knitting needles. They were deliberately chosen as quiet knitting needles. They don't make any noise." Now, please understand, when I refer to her as compulsive, that's not a complaint. After all, I'm the primary beneficiary of her work, and I still have a collection of almost 36 sweaters that prove the dexterity as well as the passion with which she approached it. Like many knitters, I believe, Nikki thought you could never have too much yarn or too many projects. She managed to pass along both the talent and the passion for knitting to our daughter Beth. And after Nikki's death, it took me not one, but two car trips to Florida with the car filled with all of the extra yarn and supplies and paraphernalia that I found in every corner of the house. In addition to being committed to knitting, Nikki thought it was an obligation to support the independent yarn shops, just as some people do independent bookstores. And so when we were making road trips, when we'd get off the interstate and go through small towns, she would frequently want to explore to see if there was a knit shop in town. And if there was, she would have to stop and look around. And if she stopped and looked around, she would find something, invariably. On one of those trips, it was about 2005, but I'm not sure exactly if that was the right year. We went through a small town in Montana that had such a shop. In addition to having yarn and materials, it had a selection of books related to knitting. And Nikki found one that had this interesting title, Knitting into the Mystery. And so without reading it, she picked it up and bought it. And then she started reading it and discovered that the book essentially argued, as Rabbi London said, that the act of knitting was an exercise of Christian ministry. And Nikki said to herself and to me, well, it has to be more than that. And so she called Rabbi London, and Rabbi London has told you that story. And they figured out a Jewish analogy to the line of argument made in the book, that being wrapped in a shawl was an act of healing, and that the act of making and presenting a shawl was a signification of community and its preservation. And so those were the animating ideas, at least as I recall, behind the organization known as Soul Stitchers. The original thought was that a group of people would make these shawls, and the rabbis would take them along when they made hospital visits and would leave them behind as a memento from the synagogue. But as you might expect, the supply of shawls quickly exceeded the demand, if that's the way that the demand was calculated. And so before long, there was a shelf of extra shawls out in the foyer, and people were encouraged, if they knew someone who was ill or in need of healing, to take one and give it to the person. The shawls, as Bluma said, were not identified with their creators, because the idea was that these were not gifts from an individual person, these were gifts from the community. And so they had labels that Rabbi London had procured that said approximately this: made with best wishes for a refuah shlema, Beth Emet Soul Stitchers. And before long, notes of gratitude came coming into the synagogue addressed to Beth Emet Soul Stitchers, saying, I don't know who you are, but I want you to know how much of a difference this shawl made to me. Rabbi Noble, as soon as he found out about this project, quickly and enthusiastically endorsed and supported it, but he always referred to the shawls as blankets. And Nikki would chuckle that she was unable to explain to him the difference. But in Nikki's obituary that was published in the Tribune, Rabbi Noble was quoted as saying, when you wrapped yourself in them, you felt hugged and cared for by the congregation. And then noting the spiritual dimension, he added, perhaps a hug from God. At Nikki's funeral service, this bima was arrayed as it is tonight with samples of the handiwork made by the soul stitchers, and there were comments made about Nikki's role in creating and nurturing the group. Rabbi London connected this work to this week's Torah portion, and of course, rabbis can connect anything to any Torah portion, we all know. But the Torah portion that the work of soul stitchers really fits the best, in my opinion, is back in the book of Exodus, when God explains why the artisan Bezalel is selected for preparing the tapestries for the Mishkan. And the words were adapted by my daughter and son-in-law and me, and they appear on Nikki's gravestone. Filled with the Spirit of God, endowed with knowledge, skill, understanding, and wisdom. Following Nikki's death, it seemed for a time as though the Soul Stitchers project had run its course. Many of the people involved were themselves in ill health, and some of them fairly soon passed on. It is wonderful to see it restarted and revived. Bluma called me up and said, would I mind if a group of congregants restarted this group and in Nikki's memory preserved the name of Soul Stitchers and the ideas that embodied it? Would I mind? I said, I would be honored, and Nikki, if she knew, would be absolutely thrilled to know that this important work is carried on. May the new incarnation of Soul Stitchers have a long life, and may it again provide healing and nourishment of the soul as it did before.
I would now like to acknowledge all of the people who have knitted these wonderful shawls and are in the current Soul Stitchers group. There, as Bluma mentioned, a minion of women who have done this work, but she wants to let everyone to know, as I think she said, that those who identify not as women or somewhere along the gender spectrum or as men, you're also allowed to be part of the group. But today we're going to acknowledge those who have done this wonderful work. And I'll invite you, if you're here in the sanctuary or you're joining us remotely, if you will rise, because we'd like to acknowledge you and also to offer a blessing to you and to these beautiful shawls. The current group is Marcia Baum, Becky Fields, Judy Feinstein, Valerie Kretschmer, Iris Towson Lieberman, Michelle Oxman, Gail Schuck, Judith Simon, Arlene Steele, and Bluma Stoller. If you'll stay standing for a moment, we'd just like to offer you a blessing. Dear God, we thank you for the vision and compassion of Nikki Zarevsky, who taught us through word and deed what it means to live by the mitzvot, the sacred obligations with which you have entrusted us to live. Her life was a blessing, and we are grateful that her legacy lives on. Today, we are also appreciative of the enthusiasm of Bluma Stoller, who has picked up the mantle of leadership, and for all of the amazing Soul Stitchers. As we recall the compassion you, O God, extended to our ancestors while they were on their journey from Egyptian bondage to the Promised Land, we ask you to bless these healing shawls that have been made faithfully and lovingly by our Beth Emet Soul Stitchers. We also ask you, God, to bless the knitters with wisdom and skill. May their good deeds nourish them and serve as an inspiration for all of us. We pray that those who receive these beautiful shawls will feel the loving embrace of the knitters who created them. May all who are in need find comfort and peace and relief from suffering and pain. We pray for healing and renewal of body and spirit for all who ail. Amen. And thank you.
To honor the Soul Stitchers and what they've done, I selected a song that felt very appropriate for the soul stitches for a couple reasons. The first is the song is called Yad B'Yad, hand in hand, which I don't knit or crochet or do anything like that myself, but it always looks like there's kind of hand in hand. So I thought symbolically Yad B'Yad worked pretty nicely. But I also really like this final line, Imen Kemach ein Torah, Imen Torah ein Kemach, because I really feel like this concept of soul stitch is bringing in this act of loving kindness, this good deed, in the context of a Jewish setting. It's a secular activity. There's nothing in the Torah talking about knitting, but I like this idea of, in this case, kemach means they translate it to sustenance, or it's really flour. But this idea that taking the mundane, without the stuff that we do outside of the synagogue, there is no Torah, and without Torah, there's really nothing outside the confines of this sacred space. So it felt like an appropriate song to sing in honor of the soul stitches. Yad beyad echad im hasheni, am echad im lev echad, keinanu nadlik mesuat olam, nadlika ke'am echad, yad beyad echad, keinanu nadlik. Imen kemach ein Torah, Imen Torah ein kemach. Imen kemach ein Torah, Imen Torah ein kemach. It can be you, it can be me, it can be all the people all over the world, lending, caring, sharing hand in hand. It can be you, it can be me, it can be all the people all over the world, lending, caring, sharing hand in hand. Imen kemach ein Torah, Imen Torah ein kemach. Imen kemach ein Torah, Imen Torah ein kemach.
We'd like to also offer a blessing of thanksgiving, a Shechianu, for this moment of the soul stitchers being reinvigorated and creating these beautiful shawls. And after we say the blessing, I also want you to think in your heart, as David mentioned, the idea behind the shawls is that the rabbi's cantor would bring the shawls to people in the hospital if they were sick or at home, which we do. But there are many more shawls than people to bring them to that we know directly. So we also encourage you that if you have somebody in your life who is really in need of this kind of loving hug, want to find comfort from the community, as the service concludes, I invite you to come up and take a moment and look at the shawls and see if there's one that might be appropriate for somebody that you're thinking about. And I invite you to take it with you this evening, because it would be really wonderful to share these shawls. They're not just to be here on the beam or in the offices here, but to be shared with people. So please do take a moment in your heart to think about who that person might be in your life and to select the right shawl for them today.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.